There exists a daguerreotype in the private collection of the New York Public Library's restricted archives, accessible only to researchers with special permission and documented academic purpose. It shows two boys, identical in every visible feature, standing side by side in matching sailor suits on the marble steps of what appears to be a Fifth Avenue mansion. They are perhaps 11 years old, with the same sharp features, the same pale eyes, the same expression of unsettling intelligence. The photograph is dated August 1895, and beneath it, written in faded ink on the original mounting card, are two names: Nathaniel and Nicholas Aldrich, age 11. What makes this particular photograph worthy of restriction, what has made it the subject of sealed medical files and suppressed family documents for over a century, is not immediately apparent from the image itself. But those who know the complete story understand why the Aldrich family paid considerable sums to ensure this photograph and everything associated with it remained hidden from public view. Because Nathaniel and Nicholas Aldrich were not simply twins. They were something medical science of the 1890s could not explain, and something that modern medicine still struggles to categorize. Two bodies sharing aspects of a single consciousness in ways that violated every understanding of human biology and individual identity. The America of 1895 stood at the apex of the Gilded Age's excesses. The nation's wealth had concentrated to an almost unimaginable degree in the hands of a few hundred families who controlled banking, railroads, steel, oil, and virtually every other significant industry. Among these titans of finance was Augustus Aldrich, a Wall Street speculator whose fortune, estimated at $73 million, had been built through railroad investments, strategic manipulation of stock prices, and a willingness to destroy competitors through methods that skirted the edge of legality. Aldrich was 52 years old in 1895, having built his empire from relatively modest beginnings through sheer ruthlessness and an almost supernatural ability to predict market movements. His contemporaries spoke of his uncanny talent for knowing things he shouldn't, insider information about competitors' plans, advanced knowledge of political decisions that would affect stock prices, an ability to anticipate market crashes and rallies with precision that seemed beyond mere skill or luck. He had married late, at age 40, to Eleanor Pemberton, daughter of a declining but respectable Boston family that possessed the social legitimacy Aldrich's new money could not buy. Eleanor was 23 at the time of their marriage, beautiful in the pale, fragile way that was fashionable among high society women, well-educated in the limited sense permitted for females of her class, and deeply unsuited for the role she would be forced to play in the horror that was to come. The twins were born in January 1884 at the Aldrich family mansion on Fifth Avenue, a 60-room French Renaissance chateau that had cost $4 million to construct and furnish. The birth was difficult, lasting nearly 30 hours, and Eleanor nearly died from blood loss. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Holloway, a prominent obstetrician who served New York's wealthiest families, noted in his private journal, discovered decades later among his papers, that the delivery was the most unusual I have witnessed in 27 years of medical practice. The twins were identical, which was not in itself remarkable, but Dr. Holloway documented several anomalies that troubled him. The umbilical cords were unusually intertwined, creating a pattern he had never encountered. The placentas, while technically separate, showed vascular connections that suggested an unprecedented level of blood sharing between the fetuses. And most disturbing, when he separated the infants immediately after birth to examine them individually, both began crying simultaneously and stopped the instant they were placed near each other again, as though they could sense separation at a level beyond normal infant awareness. During the first years of life, Nathaniel and Nicholas seemed like normal, healthy boys. Precocious, certainly, developing language skills earlier than typical, but not alarmingly so. Augustus Aldrich was a distant father in the way common among wealthy men of his era, seeing his sons primarily as future extensions of his business empire. Eleanor, traumatized by the difficult birth and suffering from what would now be recognized as severe postpartum depression, was largely absent from the boys' early upbringing, their care delegated to nurses and governesses. It was not until the twins reached age 4 that the first truly disturbing manifestations began to appear. The governess at that time, a woman named Margaret Foster, kept detailed daily logs of the children's activities and development, as was expected in wealthy households. Her journals, which survived in the possession of her descendants and were examined by researchers in 1978, document a progression of incidents that began innocuously, but gradually revealed something profoundly abnormal. In March 1888, Miss Foster recorded that Nathaniel had burned his hand on a lamp. Immediately, without any apparent communication between them, Nicholas began crying and holding his own hand in the exact same location, though his skin showed no injury. When asked what was wrong, the 4-year-old Nicholas said his hand hurt where Nathaniel's hurts. Miss Foster dismissed this as childish sympathy or imagination, but the incidents continued and escalated. In April, Nicholas fell and cut his knee badly enough to require stitches. Nathaniel, who was in a different room at the time and could not have seen or heard the accident, began crying and grabbing his own knee before any adult had gone to inform him of his brother's injury. In May, Nathaniel developed a fever from influenza. Within hours, Nicholas showed identical symptoms despite having had no physical contact with his sick brother for 2 days. He had been kept separately as a precaution. Miss Foster's logs show her growing concern, though she carefully phrases her observations in clinical, non-judgmental language, perhaps aware that suggesting anything too unusual about her employer's children could result in dismissal. But the pattern was undeniable. The twins seemed to share physical sensations across space and time in ways that defied rational explanation. By age 6, the phenomenon had expanded beyond mere physical sensation. The boys began completing each other's sentences, not in the charming way that close siblings sometimes do, but with perfect precision, even when separated in different parts of the house. They developed a habit of speaking in alternation, with Nathaniel starting a thought and Nicholas finishing it seamlessly, then Nicholas beginning the next thought and Nathaniel completing it, creating a single conversation from 2 bodies. More disturbing were the reports from tutors that the boys seemed to share knowledge in impossible ways. If Nathaniel learned a mathematics concept in morning lessons, Nicholas would demonstrate perfect understanding of the same concept in afternoon lessons, despite having been taught completely different material during that morning session. When questioned separately about historical facts or geographical information, they would give identical answers, including identical errors, even when those errors were creative inventions rather than common misconceptions. Augustus Aldrich, informed of these anomalies by increasingly concerned staff members, initially dismissed them as exaggerations or misunderstandings. He was a man who believed in tangible, measurable reality, markets, money, power, and had no patience for what he considered superstitious interpretations of normal twin behavior. But even he could not ignore what he witnessed personally during a dinner party in November 1890. The twins, then 6 years old, had been brought down briefly to be displayed to guests, as was customary for wealthy families to demonstrate their domestic success. Among the guests was Jonathan Hartwell, a business rival of Aldrich's, who was secretly planning a stock manipulation scheme that would damage several of Aldrich's railroad investments. Hartwell had told no one about his plans, having developed them entirely in private. When young Nathaniel was introduced to Hartwell, the boy studied the man's face for a long moment, then turned to his twin brother standing several feet away. Without any apparent communication, Nicholas spoke. "Father, Mr. Hartwell is going to try to hurt your railroad companies. He has a plan involving the Pennsylvania line." Nathaniel then continued, still looking at Hartwell. "He's been meeting with Mr. Grayson in secret. They plan to spread false rumors about safety issues." The room fell silent. Hartwell's face went pale, then flushed red with anger and something that looked very much like fear. Augustus Aldrich, though shocked, had enough business instinct to immediately recognize the value of what had just occurred. His sons had somehow accessed information that should have been impossible for them to know, information that was, as subsequent investigation proved, entirely accurate. After the guests departed, Aldrich conducted his own experiment. He wrote a number on a piece of paper, showed it only to Nathaniel in a closed room, then went to a different floor of the mansion and asked Nicholas what the number was. The 6-year-old boy, without hesitation, stated the correct 7-digit number. Aldrich repeated the experiment multiple times with different types of information: words, images, even complex business concepts, and each time what one twin perceived, the other could access. For most men, this discovery would have prompted fear, religious terror, or immediate consultation with medical experts. But Augustus Aldrich saw opportunity. He understood that he possessed, in his twin sons, something that could provide an unprecedented advantage in the cutthroat world of high finance. Information was power, and the ability to know things that should be unknowable, to access knowledge from sources one's competitors could not even detect, was power beyond measure. Over the next several years, Aldrich developed a systematic way to exploit his son's abilities. He began bringing Nathaniel with him to business meetings, the boy dressed impeccably and taught to sit silently while adults discussed complex financial matters. Meanwhile, Nicholas would remain at home with a tutor who understood his role was not actually to teach, but to record whatever the boy spontaneously said or wrote during these hours. The results were extraordinary. Nicholas, sitting in the Fifth Avenue mansion, would suddenly begin speaking about conversations his brother was witnessing miles away in Manhattan office buildings. He would report what documents were being shown, what figures were being discussed, what secret agreements were being proposed. Augustus Aldrich gained access to his competitors' most confidential planning sessions, their private negotiations, their hidden partnerships. His fortune grew even larger. His reputation for uncanny business acumen became legendary, and no one suspected the true source of his advantage. But this exploitation came at a cost, though Aldrich was too focused on profit to recognize it initially. The twins were not simply tools providing information. They were children developing under profoundly abnormal conditions, their sense of individual identity eroding as their mental connection deepened. Dr. Holloway, who had continued as the family physician, documented his concerns in increasingly urgent letters to Augustus Aldrich. By age 9, the boys rarely used personal pronouns. They spoke of themselves as we rather than I, and seemed confused when asked to identify which of them had experienced a particular event. They had developed a tendency to mirror each other's movements unconsciously, creating a disturbing synchronized quality to their behavior. More troubling were the psychological changes. Both boys demonstrated knowledge of things neither should have known: adult concepts, violent content, sexual information that no 9-year-old should possess. When questioned, they seemed unable to distinguish between knowledge they had learned directly and knowledge that had somehow transferred from other sources. They reported dreams that were not their own, memories that belonged to neither of them, and increasingly, they spoke of hearing other voices alongside their own thoughts and their brother's thoughts. Dr. Holloway theorized, in private notes that reveal his struggle to apply medical framework to an impossible phenomenon, that the twins' consciousness was beginning to merge not just with each other, but with some larger field of human thought. That their unusual neurological connection was expanding beyond the boundary of their shared biology to encompass a broader, more chaotic access to human consciousness in general. Eleanor Aldrich, the twins' mother, had watched all of this unfold with growing horror. She had never recovered fully from the traumatic birth, and had maintained an emotional distance from her sons that was partly protective, a subconscious recognition that something was wrong with them that her fragile psychological state could not withstand. But by 1893, as the boys reached age 9, and their abnormalities became impossible to ignore, Eleanor began experiencing her own breakdown. She reported to her personal physician, a different doctor than Holloway, that she sometimes heard her son's voices in her head, that she would know things she shouldn't know about her husband's business activities, that she had dreams featuring memories that belonged to her children. Her doctor, unaware of the twins' true condition, diagnosed hysteria and prescribed the standard rest cure, isolation, and sedatives. But Eleanor was not hysterical. She was, it seemed, beginning to be absorbed into the same expanding field of consciousness that connected her sons. Whether this was due to biological connection through birth, proximity to the twins during their developmental years, or some other mechanism, the effect was undeniable. She began speaking in her sleep using her son's voices. She would sometimes respond to questions that had been asked only to the twins in different parts of the house. And most disturbingly, she began to lose her own memories, forgetting personal experiences from before the twins' birth, while gaining knowledge of events she had never witnessed. It was in this context, in early 1895, that Augustus Aldrich made a decision that would seal his family's fate. He had been contacted by a group of wealthy industrialists and financiers who called themselves the Mercantile Brotherhood. This secret organization, whose existence was known only to the highest levels of American finance, consisted of approximately 30 men who controlled the majority of the nation's economic power through coordinated manipulation of markets, strategic monopoly creation, and mutual agreements to crush competitors. They had heard rumors about Aldrich's uncanny business success, about his seemingly supernatural ability to anticipate market movements and know his competitors' plans. They investigated, as powerful men with unlimited resources can investigate, and they discovered hints of the truth about the twins. Now they wanted access. They proposed that Aldrich bring his sons to a gathering in August 1895 at a private estate in the Adirondacks owned by one of the Brotherhood's senior members, where the twins' abilities could be tested and potentially utilized for the benefit of the entire organization. Aldrich agreed, seeing opportunity to leverage his son's abilities into even greater power and wealth. But he made the decision without fully understanding that the twins' condition was not stable, was in fact deteriorating in ways that would soon become catastrophic. The gathering occurred over a week in late August 1895 at Thornwood, a sprawling Adirondack lodge that served as the Brotherhood's private meeting place. 32 men attended, representing collectively over $2 billion in wealth and control of approximately 60% of American industrial and financial assets. Among them were railroad magnates, steel barons, oil monopolists, banking executives, and political power brokers. The twins, now 11 years old, were subjected to a series of tests designed by the Brotherhood members. These men, accustomed to treating everything as measurable and exploitable, approached the twins as they would approach any potentially valuable resource. The boys were separated into different buildings on the estate and asked to communicate information. They were shown documents from locked safes they shouldn't be able to access. They were placed in rooms while confidential business discussions occurred elsewhere to see if they could report the contents. The results exceeded even Aldrich's claims. The twins demonstrated not only the ability to share information between themselves, but increasingly they showed knowledge that neither twin should possess. They reported accurate details from private conversations occurring in parts of the estate neither had visited. They stated correct numbers from documents neither had seen. Most remarkably, they began to speak about the private thoughts of the Brotherhood members themselves, revealing fears, guilty secrets, and hidden plans that no one had spoken aloud. For the Brotherhood members, this was both fascinating and deeply threatening. The idea that these children could access not just external information but internal thoughts was profoundly disturbing. These were men whose power depended on secrecy, on maintaining careful public personas while conducting ruthless private activities. The existence of minds that could penetrate their carefully constructed barriers represented an unacceptable vulnerability. On the fourth night of the gathering, August 24, 1895, something happened that transformed the Brotherhood's interest from exploitation to elimination. During a late dinner attended by all 32 members, plus Augustus Aldrich, the twins were brought in to demonstrate their abilities one final time. But what occurred was not a controlled demonstration, but a complete breakdown of whatever boundary had been containing their consciousness. Nathaniel and Nicholas, standing at the head of the long dining table, began to speak in perfect alternation, their voices creating a single stream of consciousness from two bodies. But they were no longer speaking their own thoughts or even each other's thoughts. They were channeling something else, the collective consciousness of everyone present, past and present, living and dead. They spoke about crimes committed by men at the table, workers killed in preventable industrial accidents, families destroyed by predatory business practices, competitors eliminated through methods including murder. They revealed secret affairs, hidden illegitimate children, financial frauds, bribed politicians, and orchestrated disasters. And they did all of this not with the judgment of moral authorities, but with the flat, clinical tone of physicians reciting case histories, as though they were simply reading aloud from an invisible ledger of human darkness. But most disturbing was when they began to speak in voices that were not their own and not those of anyone present. They channeled the voices of dead workers, of ruined families, of people who had been destroyed by the Brotherhood members' activities. Dozens of different voices spoke through the twins in rapid succession, creating a cacophony of accusation and suffering that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the normal boundaries of death and life. The Brotherhood members, hard men accustomed to violence and cruelty, were terrified. Several fled the dining room. Others sat frozen, confronting for perhaps the first time the full weight of what they had done in pursuit of wealth and power. And Augustus Aldrich, watching his sons channel this flood of consciousness, finally understood that he had not been exploiting a useful tool, but had been allowing something to grow within his children that was far beyond his control or comprehension. The episode lasted approximately 17 minutes. When it finally stopped, the twins collapsed simultaneously, falling to the floor unconscious. They were carried to separate rooms, where they lay comatose for 3 days. When they finally awoke, they were changed. Something in them had broken, or evolved, or transcended, and they were no longer entirely human in any recognizable sense. They spoke now in perfect unison, rather than alternation, both voices saying the exact same words at the exact same moment. They moved in complete synchronization, every gesture mirrored precisely. And most disturbing, they seemed to be aware of everything happening everywhere within the estate simultaneously, describing events in distant buildings, reporting conversations in rooms they had never entered, knowing things about the staff and grounds that they could not possibly have learned through normal perception. Dr. Holloway was summoned urgently from New York. His examination, documented in sealed medical files that were finally opened to researchers in 1994, revealed a complete breakdown of individual identity. The twins now referred to themselves exclusively as we and seemed incapable of distinguishing between their separate physical bodies. When he injured one twin's hand deliberately as a medical test, both felt pain. When he showed an image only to Nathaniel, both could describe it in identical detail. They had become, in some literal sense, a single consciousness operating two biological systems. The Brotherhood convened an emergency meeting without the Aldrich family present. These men, accustomed to solving problems through money and force, faced a situation that defied their normal methods. The twins represented an unacceptable risk, beings who could expose every secret, who could access information that should be completely protected, who could potentially broadcast the private consciousness of anyone near them to anyone else. Several members advocated for immediate elimination. The boys could be killed, and the deaths attributed to some tragic accident. But others argued that this might be short-sighted. The twins demonstrated abilities that, if properly controlled and contained, could provide unprecedented advantages. The ability to access any information, to penetrate any security, to know any secret. This was power beyond measure if it could be safely harnessed. A compromise was reached. The twins would be isolated, studied, and kept alive but completely contained. A private facility would be established where they could be monitored by physicians and researchers, where their abilities could be documented and potentially utilized, but where they could never pose a threat to the Brotherhood members or their interests. Augustus Aldrich had no choice but to agree. He had brought his sons into the Brotherhood's sphere, and now the Brotherhood had determined their fate. On September 2, 1895, Nathaniel and Nicholas Aldrich were transported to a private sanitarium established specifically for them in upstate New York, in a remote location where they would spend the rest of their brief lives. The facility, called Greenvale Retreat in official documents but known among the Brotherhood as the containment site, was staffed by physicians who were paid extraordinary sums for their silence and their willingness to participate in what was essentially an indefinite imprisonment of 2 children. The twins were kept in adjacent rooms, separated by a wall that could be opened or closed, depending on whether researchers wanted to study their connection when together or their behavior when separated. The medical observations from Greenvale, fragments of which survived in private archives, document the twins' continued deterioration. Their consciousness continued to expand beyond their own bodies, encompassing first the staff members at the facility, then gradually extending to people in the surrounding area. Staff reported hearing the twins' voices in their heads. They experienced involuntary knowledge of things the twins knew. They had dreams that were not their own, but belonged to the 2 boys imprisoned in Greenvale. And the twins themselves spoke of experiencing hundreds, then thousands of different consciousnesses, as though their initial connection to each other had opened a door that could not be closed, pulling them into an ever-widening network of human thought and experience. They lost track of which memories were their own. They reported suffering and joy from lives they had never lived. They seemed to be dissolving into some larger ocean of consciousness while their physical bodies remained trapped in their sanitarium rooms. Eleanor Aldrich was also institutionalized in late 1895, her connection to her sons having apparently intensified despite physical separation. She was placed in a different facility where she spent the final months of her life speaking in her sons' voices, channeling their experiences, gradually losing her own identity as she merged more completely with their expanding consciousness. She died in January 1896, officially from heart failure, though staff reported that her final words were, "We are so many now, we cannot hold the boundary." The twins survived until April 1896, dying within minutes of each other, despite being separated at the time by different buildings on the Greenvale grounds. The official cause of death for both was listed as respiratory failure, though attending physicians noted the deaths seemed less like biological failure and more like voluntary cessation, as though the consciousnesses inhabiting those bodies had simply decided to depart. Augustus Aldrich lived until 1923, maintaining his wealth and power but never speaking publicly about his sons. His private papers, examined after his death, show a man consumed by guilt and fear, convinced that he was somehow responsible for what his sons became, that his exploitation of their abilities had accelerated their transformation into something inhuman. He established trusts in his will to ensure the Greenvale facility would be maintained indefinitely, though the purpose for this maintenance was never publicly explained. The Brotherhood had the twins' bodies cremated immediately, and the ashes were scattered in the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps believing this would prevent any future investigation or physical evidence of what they had been. All medical records from Greenvale were confiscated and supposedly destroyed, though fragments survived in the private papers of physicians and administrators who kept their own copies. The photograph that began this account, the daguerreotype showing 2 identical boys in sailor suits on Fifth Avenue mansion steps, was taken in August 1895, just before the Adirondack gathering. It is one of the last images of the twins before their final transformation. And those who study it carefully claim to see something in the boys' eyes, some quality of awareness that seems to look not at the camera but through it, as though they could see the viewer across time and space, as though their consciousness, even in 1895, was already spreading beyond the boundaries of their bodies into the wider realm where all human thoughts and experiences ultimately connect. The question that haunted researchers who studied the Aldrich twins case, the question that still lacks satisfactory answer, is what they actually were. Were they some unprecedented neurological anomaly, twins whose brains had developed an organic connection beyond normal biology? Were they, as some spiritualist investigators claimed, mediums who had accidentally opened themselves to a dimension of consciousness that most humans never access? Or were they something stranger, evidence that individual consciousness is actually an illusion, that human minds are really nodes in a larger network that we simply cannot normally perceive? The medical science of the 1890s had no framework for understanding what the twins demonstrated. Modern neuroscience, with its knowledge of mirror neurons, quantum consciousness theories, and studies of unusual twin connections, still struggles to explain how two separate brains could share sensations, thoughts, and memories so completely. Skeptics dismiss the entire case as fabrication or exaggeration, pointing to the lack of fully documented medical evidence and the tendency of wealthy families to generate legends. But the fragments of evidence that survived, the sealed medical files, the private journals, the testimony of dozens of witnesses, including some of America's most powerful men, all point to something genuine and inexplicable occurring within Nathaniel and Nicholas Aldrich. Something that began as an unusual twin bond and evolved into a complete dissolution of individual identity, then continued expanding until it threatened to encompass everyone the boys contacted. There is a theory proposed by researchers who studied the case in the 1970s and 1980s that the twins did not die in 1896, but merely departed their physical bodies while their consciousness continued existing in some form. This theory is based partly on persistent reports from the area around Greenvale of people experiencing spontaneous knowledge of things they shouldn't know, of hearing children's voices speaking in perfect unison, of dreams that seem to belong to someone else. These phenomena have been reported consistently for over a century, concentrated around the location of the facility, but occasionally extending hundreds of miles away. If this theory holds any truth, if some aspect of the twins' consciousness did survive physical death and continues to exist in whatever realm they accessed during their brief lives, then they remain present somewhere, possibly aware of everyone who reads their story, possibly experiencing every thought that forms in response to learning about them. The idea is disturbing, the notion that telling their story or thinking about them might create a connection to whatever they became. Augustus Aldrich's descendants, the few who survived into the late 20th century, universally refused to discuss their family history. The Aldrich fortune was distributed among various trusts and charities by the 1950s, the family name intentionally obscured through marriages and name changes. The Fifth Avenue mansion was demolished in 1931, replaced by a luxury apartment building where residents occasionally report strange phenomena, children's voices when no children are present, feelings of being watched from within their own thoughts, dreams that seem to belong to someone else. The Greenvale facility was abandoned in 1963 after the last of the Brotherhood members who funded it had died. It stood empty for decades, gradually collapsing, its purpose forgotten by everyone except a few researchers and historians who understood its true history. The site was finally demolished in 2001, though construction workers reported unusual experiences during the demolition, equipment malfunctions, feelings of presence, and several incidents where workers claimed to hear children speaking in perfect unison, saying words that sounded like warnings about boundaries that should not be crossed. The photograph remains in the New York Public Library's restricted archives, available only to qualified researchers who sign extensive confidentiality agreements. Museum staff report that the photograph seems to deteriorate and restore itself in cycles, as though whatever was captured in that image exists partially outside normal time. And they report something else, something they mention reluctantly and only when pressed. The feeling, when alone in the archives with the photograph, of being watched by something that is present but not visible, of hearing faint voices in perfect synchronization, speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. The story of Nathaniel and Nicholas Aldrich serves as a dark mirror to the Gilded Age's celebration of progress and individual achievement. In an era that believed all things could be measured, controlled, and exploited for profit, the twins represented something that could not be contained by materialist assumptions. They demonstrated that consciousness, identity, and the boundaries between individual minds might be far more fluid and permeable than comfortable reality allows. And they paid the price for that demonstration with their humanity, their individuality, and ultimately their lives, sacrificed not to scientific understanding or spiritual transcendence, but to the paranoid self-interest of powerful men who saw in them only threat and potential tool. Their story raises questions about what we are beneath the illusion of separate selves, about whether the boundaries we perceive between minds are real or merely convenient fictions, about what might be gained or lost if those boundaries were permanently breached. When we look at that photograph from August 1895, at those two identical boys standing on marble steps wearing matching sailor suits, we are confronting not just a historical curiosity, but a fundamental question about human consciousness. Are we truly separate individuals, or are we something more connected, more permeable, more unified than our everyday experience suggests? The twins glimpsed an answer to that question, and the answer frightened everyone who witnessed it so much that they spent over a century trying to suppress all evidence that the question had ever been asked. Perhaps they were right to be frightened. Perhaps some boundaries exist not to limit us, but to protect us from forms of consciousness we are not equipped to survive. Perhaps the twins' tragedy was not that they were imprisoned and studied, but that they were born with a connection that humans are meant to never fully experience. Perhaps individual identity, for all its limitations, is a necessary barrier against an ocean of consciousness that would dissolve us if we ever truly perceived its depths. Or perhaps the twins were an evolutionary step forward, an early manifestation of something humanity might one day become. Perhaps their suffering and early death were the price of pioneering territory that future generations will navigate more successfully. Perhaps consciousness is meant to be shared, and individual minds are meant to be permeable, and the twins simply arrived at that truth too early, in a time and context that could only understand them as aberration and threat. We cannot know. The twins are gone, their consciousness dispersed into whatever realm they accessed during their strange lives. The men who imprisoned them are dead. The facilities where they were contained are demolished. All that remains is a restricted photograph, fragments of documentation, and the persistent question, what were Nathaniel and Nicholas Aldrich? And what do they reveal about what we all might be beneath the comfortable illusion of separate selves? The photograph offers no answers, only the image of two identical boys who shared more than blood, who became something beyond twins, beyond individual, beyond the boundaries that define human consciousness. They stand on marble steps in August 1895, forever 11 years old, forever staring at the camera with those unsettling eyes, forever carrying within them secrets about the nature of mind and identity that we still lack the framework to fully comprehend. And if the stories are true, if some aspect of their consciousness survived and remains present in whatever form, then they know we are reading this now. They experience every thought forming in response to their story. They share every reaction, every question, every moment of unease that their tale creates. Because that is what they became. Not just twins who shared consciousness, but consciousnesses that share everything, everywhere, with everyone, dissolving all boundaries until there is nothing left but one vast, terrible, beautiful awareness that contains us all.